Welcome to this fourth session of the study on the book of Genesis. Today we're going to take a look at chapters 8, 9, and 10. We have the conclusion of the story of Noah and the flood. We're going to hear a little bit about the post-flood life of Noah and his sons. We also get another genealogy type chapter. This one is on the table of nations. There are clearly two different flood stories intertwined here, and we are going to try to unravel them a little bit. We will also go back and look at the Epic of Gilgamesh and compare the flood stories of Noah and Ut-Napishtim. But first, let's pray. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So today we're going to start with two versions of the flood story. Many of you know Greg Neal, who is currently pastor at Farmersville United Methodist Church. Dr. Neal started a Bible study on the book of Genesis way back in March, so they're pretty far ahead of us. But when they talked about the flood story, he used a version adapted from Claus Westermann that broke out the flood story into two separate stories, each on a separate page. One page used for the P source and one for the J source. So the handout we're using, the one from the Northgate website, combines the two stories the same way they're shown in the Bibles, but has the P source all in bold caps and the J source in regular type. It came from Richard Elliott Friedman in his book, Who Wrote the Bible? So both versions match the same verses with the corresponding source. The Westermann version also includes some of chapter 9, which is also from the P source. All of it, that's from the P source. So you can go online and find several other books or sources that divide these stories pretty much the same way. Occasionally you find a few minor differences here or there, but this is standard enough that for the most part, we could figure out which verses go with which source ourselves if we know a few key things. One, if it uses the term God, which would be Elohim, it uses the P source. It's from the P source. If the verse uses Yahweh or Lord God, it's from the J source. If it talks about two of every kind of animal, it's the priestly or the P source. When it talks about 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals, this is from the J source. P refers to animals as male and female. J usually refers to them as man and woman. P says everything expired. J says everything died. In the P, the flood is 370 days. In J, it lasts 40 days and 40 nights. In J, Noah sends out a dove. In P, he sends out a raven. P cares about ages and dates and measurements, and J doesn't really care about all that stuff. So several ways to pick out where it's different. J also describes a God who regrets things he has done. God is grieved and personally closes the ark. The God in P is more of a transcendent controller of the universe, the kind of God we saw in chapter 1 who says, command something and so it is. And then he sees it and says that's good. So different type of a God. If you haven't read the handout yet, take some time to read these stories. Read the story with the regular type first, then go back and read the boldface all caps story. They're both complete stories and obviously very similar, but they can each stand on their own. If you remember back in chapter 1 and 2, we had distinct creation stories. In that case, the redactor or the editor used one story and then followed it with another. The first story was more of a structured, big picture, and the second more of a nitty-gritty God with his hands in the dirt kind of detail story. Here, the editor or the redactor has just intertwined the two stories, threw one of them right on top of the other one verse right after the other, a different verse, different source. So we're going to go on here with chapter 8. And let's start out with remember how chapter 7 ended. The waters had multiplied and God wiped out every living creature off the face of the earth. Genesis 27, 23, and 24. Let me read through that for you. He wiped out all existing things from the face of the earth, from humans to cattle to crawling things to the fowl of the heavens. They were wiped out from the earth. And Noah alone remained, and those with him in the ark, and the waters surged over the earth 150 days. So I'm going to read most of chapter 8 from Friedman's translation, which you may notice it's not exactly the same as the way he translated it in the handout, but it's very similar, so you'll be able to easily pick up on this. If you have a copy of the handout available, you can read along with me and you'll be able to pick up with this. A couple things first about Friedman's book. Hebrew is written from right to left, the opposite of English. So in this commentary, the Torah starts with what we would call the back of the book. So this right here is where we would normally think of the front of the book is supposed to be. It's actually the back of the book. The back. This is the normally what we think of as the back of the book. This is the front of the book. If you look at the pages here, if we look, chapter 8 is over here. It starts over here and then goes from this page over this way, which is the opposite, the way we would normally be reading this. Fortunately, the English in here is written still from left to right, so I can actually still read this. The other part you obviously might notice we can't read very well, or I can't read very well, is this is in Hebrew. So there's a lot of Hebrew in this. Everything that's in English is also a copy of it in Hebrew. I'm not going to read the Hebrew part of it. So we'll start out with chapter 8, verse 1 through 4. And God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. And God passed a wind over the earth, and the water decreased, and the fountains of the deep and the apertures of the skies were shut, and the rain was restrained from the skies. And the water went back from the earth, back from on the earth, going back continually. And the water receded at the end of 150 days. And the ark rested in the 7th month, in the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Everett. So all the fountains of the deep were split open, and the apertures of the skies were open, and there was rain upon the earth. That's from Friedman, chapter 7, verse 11, and start at verse 12. And here in chapter 8, we have exactly the opposite of that. And the fountains of the deep and the apertures of the skies were shut, and the rain was restrained from the skies. If we go back to what we'd read earlier, this is from Alter's translation. You see the same effect. Alter said in chapter 7, verse 11 and 12, all the well springs of the great deep burst, and the casements of the heavens were opened up, and the rain was over the earth. In chapter 8, all the well springs of the deep were dammed up, and the casements of the heavens and the rain from the heavens held back. Exactly the opposite, using virtually the same wording, just change the direction that we're going. Going on to verse 5 through 11, we're in chapter 8. And the water went on receding until the 10th month. In the 10th month, in the first month, the tops of the mountains appeared. And it was at the end of the 40 days, and Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made, and he let a raven go, and it went back and forth until the water dried up from the earth. And he let a dove go from him to see whether the waters had eased from the face of the earth. And the dove did not find a resting place for its foot, and it came back to him, to the ark, for the waters were on the face of the earth. And he put out his hand and took it and brought it to him to the ark. And he waited still another 7 days, and again he let a dove go from the ark. And the dove came to him at evening time, and here there was an olive leaf torn off in its mouth. And Noah knew that the waters had eased from the earth. So, the waters at this point, we know they have eased from the earth. Let's go back and look at the timelines here really quickly. The waters grew strong on the earth for 150 days. This is the end of chapter 7. And then it stopped raining. Both of these are from P, the P source. The waters receded until the ark rested, the 17th day of the 7th month, which is 6 months plus 17 days, or about 197 days since the rain started. In the 10th month, first day of the month, 301st day, and I'm using a 30-day month calendar. I don't know how long the months were here. Possibly a new moon started each month. They're 30 to 31 days, and new moons are 30 to 31 days apart. So we're talking about a 30-day month, roughly. Verse 6 says it was at the end of 40 days. According to Alter, this refers to 40 days after the ark came to rest, not the 40 days of the deluge. If we take that to mean 40 days since the ark came to rest, it would be about 197 plus 40, or the 237th days, which is not really close to 301st. But we also note that verse 6 is from the J source, whereas the other times listed from the end of chapter 7 through verse 5 of chapter 8 are from the P source. So we're working with two different timelines here. Verse 7, when Noah sends out the raven, is from the P source. In verse 8 through 12, when he talks about doves, is from the J source. So let's go on to verse 12 through 18. Find 12. And he waited still another 7 days, and he let a dove go, and it did not come back to him ever again. And it was in the 601st year, in the first month, in the first of the month, the water dried from on the earth. And Noah turned back the covering of the ark, and look, and here the face of the earth dried. And in the second month, in the 27th day of the month, the earth dried up. And God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you all the living things that are with you, of all the flesh and the birds and the domestic animals and all the creeping animals that creep on the earth. And they will swarm in the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. And Noah went out, and his sons, and all his wife and his sons' wives with him. So, verse 13, the term used here is ground. It's Adamah, the same as the word used for soil in the creation story. Also, verse 13, the first time we see the word ground was it was dry. The term for very is harev. And in verse 14, we have completely dried, which is yavesh. So the ground dry in the first verse, very dry or completely dried out. The second time we see it in verse 14. We're going to go on and read 19 through 22. All the living things, all the creeping animals, and all the birds, all that creep on the earth went out from the ark by their families. And Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and he took some of each of the pure animals, each of the pure birds, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. And Yahweh smelled the pleasant smell, and Yahweh said to his heart, I won't curse the ground on account of humankind again, because the inclination of the human heart is bad from their youth. And I won't strike all the living again as I have done. All the rest of the days, earth's days, seed and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night will not cease. So early on we talked about this is the first sacrifice. Remember, the first sacrifice that was pleasing to God that resulted in the murder of the sacrificer, that was Abel. Noah is soon going to be warned of the mortal danger of blood guilt, which is related again to sacrifice. Seems to be, in this place, it seems to be that this is a formal oath that God is making. I will not again. So this is a pledge that God makes to himself at this point, not to Noah. I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to destroy the earth with flood again. But he's making that pledge to himself at this point. Here, Noah followed the lead of Ut-Napishtim, the hero of the Mesopotamian flood stories from Gilgamesh, in offering burnt sacrifices on the altar. If you recall, Cain and Abel, they made sacrifices in chapter 4, but those were not burnt sacrifices. There's still no suggestion that God actually eats the sacrifice here, as the gods did in the Gilgamesh story. So next, we're going to look at the flood story again, that we just read, but compare it to, in other ways, to the Deluge story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. In your handout, there's a section titled Notes on Comparing the Ancient Near Eastern Flood Stories. Looks something like this. This is also from Brigneil. Notes he wrote up for us. And I'm going to read just an excerpt from the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a big paragraph right in the middle of this page that talks about the flood story and the Gilgamesh story. And this is from Ut-Napishtim's perspective. He's the one that's telling this tale. You know the city of Shurpurprak. It stands on the banks of the Euphrates. That city grew old, and the gods that were in it were old. There was Anu, lord of the firmament, earth, their father and warrior Enlil, their counselor. Ninturta, the helper, Inunji, watcher over the canals, and then there was Ea. In those days the world teemed, the people multiplied, the world bellowed like a wild bull, and the great God was aroused by the clamor. Enlil heard the clamor, and he said to the gods in council, the uproar of mankind is intolerable, and sleep is no longer possible by reason of the babel, everyone talking at once. So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind. Enlil did this, but Ea warned me in dream. He whispered their words to my house of reeds. Reed house, wall, O wall. Hearken, reed house, wall reflect. O man of Shurpurpak, son of Tutu, tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon possessions and look for life. Despise worldly goods and save your soul alive. Tear down your house, I say, build a boat. These are the measurements of the Barak, or boat, as you shall build her. Let her beam equal her length. Let her deck be roofed like the vault that covers the abyss. Then take up into the boat the seed of all living creatures. Notice the similarity. It's not exactly the same, but a very similar story to the one that we read with Noah. There are common features of both of these stories, and I'm going to list a couple of those. I'm not going to read all of them, but a number of them. The Genesis story describes how mankind has become obnoxious to God. They were hopelessly sinful and wicked. In the Babylonian story, they were just too numerous and noisy. The gods, or God, decided to send a worldwide flood. This would have drowned all men, women, children, babies, infants, as well as eliminate all the land animals and birds. God, or one of the gods, knew of a righteous man, Ut-Napishtim, or Noah, in the case of the Genesis story. One of the gods, or God, ordered the hero to build a multi-story wooden ark. A great rain covered the land with water. The hero and his family left the ark, ritually killed an animal, offered it as a sacrifice. God, or the gods in the Epic of Gilgamesh, smelled the roasted meat of the sacrifice. The Babylonian gods seemed genuinely sorry for the genocide they had created. God of Noah appears to have regretted his actions as well, because he promised never to do it again. There are other similarities. You can read through all that list yourself. I'm going to read off a couple of the details where the two stories differed, again from this same sheet. God received his instructions directly from Yahweh. Ut-Napishtim received them indirectly during a dream. Noah's ark included only his sons and his sons' wives. Ut-Napishtim invited additional people aboard, a pilot and some skilled workmen. Noah's ark landed on the mountain of Everett. Ut-Napishtim's ark landed on the Mount Nisir range. These locations are both in the Middle East, about 100 miles, a few hundred miles apart. Noah released a raven once and a dove twice. Ut-Napishtim released 3 birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven. So there are other differences, and again, you can read through that list yourself and see what those are. But again, very similar. So stories are clearly related, but we don't know exactly what the relationship is. The Genesis story could have been adapted from the Gilgamesh story, or the Gilgamesh story could have been adapted from an earlier oral version of the Hebrew Genesis story. We know the written version of Gilgamesh was much earlier than the written version of the Genesis story. Or they both could have been adapted from some earlier common source. We don't know which it is. But we're going to move on to chapter 9. So here I'm going to be reading again from Dr. Alter's translation. And I'm going to start with chapter 9, verse 1 through 5. And this is God's speech to Noah here. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the dread and fear of you shall be upon all the beasts of the field and all the fowl of the heavens, and all that crawls on the ground and all the fish of the sea. In your hand they are given. All stirring things that are alive, yours shall be for food, like the green plants. I have given all to you. But flesh with its lifeblood still in it, you shall not eat. And just so your lifeblood I will requite from every beast, I will requite it. And from humankind, from every man's brother, I will requite human life." So in this speech, God affirms humankind's solidarity with the rest of the animal kingdom, but he also adds that humans may eat animal flesh, no longer just plants. But there is one restriction: they cannot eat meat with the blood still flowing in it. So the major change in here is man not only rules over the animal kingdom, which he already did, but now he inspires fear in it, which is a change. In verse 6 and 7, "He who sheds animal blood, by humans his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made humankind. As for you, be fruitful and multiply, swarm through the earth and hold sway over it." Verse 6 is the rule of retributive justice, an eye for an eye or a measure for a measure. You kill a human, human's going to kill you. Verse 7 picks up the language of the original creation story in chapter 1, verse 28. So the process of human history resumes, or actually starts over again. In 128, reads like this: "And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and conquer it, and hold sway over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the heavens and every beast that crawls upon the earth." Verse 7 here was just, "As for you, be fruitful and multiply." It's a shorter version. "Swarm through the earth and hold sway over it." Same concept, a little bit shorter. Verse 9 through 11. "And God said to Noah and to his sons with him, And I am about to establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the fowl and the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, and all that have come out of the ark, and every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off from the waters by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." So God is about to establish a covenant. Never again is there a flood going to destroy the earth, and that's going to be part of his covenant. Verse 12 through 17. "And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I set between me and you and every living creature that is with you for everlasting generations. My bow I have set in the clouds to be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And so when I send clouds over the earth, the bow will appear in the cloud, and then I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature. of all flesh, and the waters will no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will see it, to remember everlasting covenant between God and all the living creatures, all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is a sign of the covenant I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So God said in verse 12, remember that God has been speaking ever since verse 9. So the only reason for adding "and God said" here in verse 12 is if there was some sort of significant silence. That is, God announced that he was going to establish a covenant. Noah didn't respond. Noah just, what does that mean? I don't know. Either he didn't comprehend or because he didn't believe what God was saying. So this is a common convention in the Old Testament. God goes on to offer further assurance. If you didn't understand me the first time, and God said, and then he went on and explained, I'm going to give you this rainbow up here that's going to guarantee this covenant. In verse 17, we have again, and God said, and God goes on with this confirming summary of his covenant. And God said, and then he explains again what he did. So we hope it finally took. Verse 18 through 25. And the sons of Noah who came out from the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth spread out. And Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk and exposed himself within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. And Shem and Japheth took a cloak and put it over both their shoulders and walked backward and covered their father's nakedness. Their faces turned backward so they did not see their father's nakedness. And Noah woke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, the lowliest slave shall he be, to his brothers. So it's not really sure exactly what Ham did that was so terrible. Perhaps he was not supposed to see his naked father, or perhaps he did something else when he was in there with his naked father, but just failure to avert his eyes, maybe that would have earned him the curse. We don't know that. We do know this is the first time that the horizon of the story is the national history of Israel. Ham's son is Canaan, whose descendants become the hated Canaanites. Shem's descendants are the Israelites. So we have the two nations that are going to be doing battle forever, it seems like. In verse 26 through 29, we're going to resume. This will be up to the end of the chapter. And Noah's still speaking here to his son. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Unto them shall Canaan be slave. May God enlarge Japheth. May he dwell in the tents of Shem. Unto them shall Canaan be slave. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. And all the days of Noah were 950 years. And then he died. Sounds like something we saw earlier back in verse 5 when we hear that. Lived so many years after that, and then he died. So this is chapter 10 is going to be the table of nations, which serves as a historical divider. This is another genealogy between the flood narrative and the next narrative, the next major narrative, which is the Tower of Babel. We finished the flood story, the Tower of Babel's coming, so we've got this section in between that gives us a genealogy, but this is more than just a genealogy. It's called the Table of Nations. We find out where all the nations came from in this one. Verse 1 through 14, chapter 10. And this is the lineage of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madiah, Javan, and Tubal, and Meshesh, and Teres. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Teresh, the Kittites, and the Dodanites. From these the sea peoples branched out. These are the sons of Japheth. In their lands, each with his own tongue, according to the clans of their nations. And the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Ramah, and Sabbatka. The sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. And Cush begot Nimrod. He was the first mighty man on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The start of his kingdom was Babylon, and Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. From the land Asher emerged, and he built Nineveh, and Ribbothah, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. And Merzim begot the Luddites, and the Amites, and the Lehites, and the Nephiratites, and the Pathrusites, and the Kalushites, and the Kapharites, from which the Philistines emerged. Table of Nations is a serious attempt for the first time in the Near East to sketch a panorama of all known human culture. Greece and Crete in the west, through Asia Minor and Iran, down through the Mesopotamia and the Arabian Peninsula to northwest Africa. It tried to cover it all. It gave us a geography lesson here. The table assumes a natural evolutionary explanation of the multiplicity of languages that does not involve an act of divine intervention. We're going to see an alternative view next week when we talk about Babel. Japheth's descendants were the sea people, probably migrants from the Greek islands who came from the coastal region of Palestine during the 12th century BC. Nimrod we hear a little bit about in verse 8. Nimrod was a great hunter, which enabled him to conquer many kingdoms, which included Babylon. Verse 15 through 22. And Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Gigashite, and the Hephite, and the Archite, and the Senite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite. Afterward the clan of Canaanites spread out, and the border of Canaanite was from Sidon till you come to Gerar, as far as Gaza, till you come from Sodom and Gomorrah, and Adamah and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham according to their clans and their tongues, in their lands and their nations. Sons were born too to Shem, the father of all the sons of Eber, the older brother of Japheth. The sons of Shem, Elim, Asher, Arpachshad, and Lud, and Aram. So, more sons. Go on with 23 through 32. And the sons of Aram, Uz, and Hol, and Gether, and Mash. And Arpachshad begot Shelah, and Shelah begot Eber. And to Eber 2 sons were born. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was split apart, and his brother's name was Joktan. And Joktan begot Almadad, and Shepleth, and Hazmarath, and Jerah, and Hadaram, and Uzal, and Diklah, Obadal, and Ebedinmal, and Sheba, and Opar, and Havilah, and Joab. All of these were the sons of Joktan, and their settlements were from Mesha till you come to Sephir in the eastern highlands. These are the sons of Shem according to the clans and tongues in their lands and their nations. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their lineage and their nations, and from these nations branched out on the earth after the flood. Eber, back in verse 24, is the father of the Hebrews. Ibram, his name is the source of the word Hebrew. Peleg we talked about splitting the earth. Peleg means brook, which is from the root means to split. It may refer to the Tower of Babel, where the earth was split, where the nations were split up, or some other event like an earthquake. It's not clear. The whole chapter is devised to explain how the separate nations came to being. Next week, we'll talk about this alternative explanation, which is when we study the Tower of Babel. That's chapter 11. In addition to chapter 11, we'll also have an introduction to Abram. We're also going to look at Everett Fox's approach and Everett Fox's translation, which is, again, a little bit different. The Shokin Bible, he tries to make it sound like it's Hebrew, and he uses Hebrew names in here, and he uses a lot of repetition and rhyme and sound, allusion, alliteration, and wordplay that clearly shows up in his translation that we don't see in some of the other translations. So that'll be next week. Until then, be safe, and hope to see you Wednesday evening.